So if you've heard me talk before, the two concepts you might hear me say the most are think better and be better. In many ways, at like the highest level, those classify or categorize what I'm trying to do with these videos and this journey in general. I want to think better. I want to be better as a person. And in many ways, those things go hand in hand. I think you need to think better to be better. And in many ways, you need to be better to think better. So to me, those are two really guiding principles. Simple, but important principles. I say that because in a prior video, I've talked about one of my greatest fears. And I think that greatest fear was very much in the be better category. I spoke about it in terms of the way that I approach life, the way that I approach issues and different topics is I try and be very open-minded and objective and see all sides of it. And I wondered if there are certain issues, like slavery was the one I spoke about in the video, that in hindsight, or arguably should be at the time, were so objectively, categorically wrong and evil, if I would be able to see that in the moment, or if I would try and see both sides of it or something like that. And that's a fear that I have. As I stated in that video, one of my greatest fears. I think one of my other greatest fears sits more in the think better category. So again, that was more in the be better. In the think better category, perhaps my greatest fear is this. I've talked about and I've talked about it because I've learned it, so it's a relatively well-documented thing, that our minds seek answers. We seek cohesive narratives that make sense. And when we listen to people speak, when we read a book, when we listen to a podcast, even when we talk to ourselves, we're trying to make sense of everything. If something doesn't make sense, the COVID situation, what's going on in America, we try and find a story that brings it all together and makes sense. It doesn't always have to be true. Oftentimes it's not. That's not our main objective. Our mind's main objective is we need a story that makes sense. Often we want it to align with our views and our principles, depending on how thoughtful we are. But most importantly, I would argue it needs to make sense and it needs to be cohesive. So when you think about that, and when you think about what I'm trying to do in terms of thinking better, and a lot of it, I've been using the phrase a lot of late, you gotta get into the mud, metaphorically. When you're trying to understand, for me, because I think it has to start with each individual, how we think, what our blind spots are, what our biases are, what's the why behind a lot of the things we do. I've talked about how I think there's a logic behind every action or decision that I make. And you try and question those things. You try and understand them better. And you try and push to get to as close as you can to an objective truth. Really, that's the goal, is an objective truth. The problem is, the fear that I have is that objective truth, more times than not, if not always, is not realistic. It's as I've talked about perfection. You strive for perfection, you strive for objective truth, but the reality is you may never get there. But that's okay, because in striving for it, you get better. But the fear that I have, the risk that I have is, as I go through these mental exercises, as I learn new things that seem to make sense, and I think I'm learning more about myself, and I'm understanding at deeper levels why I function the way I function, what are the emotional or ego or identity issues that I'm holding, what are the flaws in the way that I think, what are the biases, what are the blind spots. You run into this risk where you may think you came to a conclusion, or better said, an insight that seems to make sense. But how do you know it? It's true, and then it makes sense, right? Much like if you are a staunch, really passionate conservative, and a story comes out about the coronavirus, that it is a scheme that was cooked up between, Fauci and Democrats to create it in a lab in China, and they're using it to destroy the economy. It's possible that's true. I can't say for certain that it's not. But if you are a staunch conservative who loves Trump and who hates the Democrats, that story makes sense to you. It's cohesive. It's logical in the sense that those events could happen, and it fits in with the narrative you want. All those things come together and it makes you say, hey, that's probably what happened. That's the answer. That's where your mind goes. And it's easy for me to point at that person and say, that's so silly. How could they really believe that? It's not that it's definitely not true, but you need so much more evidence and information to prove that out. You can't just jump to that conclusion. But for that person, it feels real. Well, who am I to judge, right? When I'm having a deep insight about myself and I'm questioning why, I'm working at a certain job that I don't love, or I'm questioning why I fight with my wife or yell at my son as much as I do and have a bad temper. As I work through that in my mind and I question, which I think is a good thing, I will often come to insights that I think tell me, that's why I do it. And it's very comforting. It's very natural. It's very instinctual almost as you come to those insights to think just like that person, that conservative, hearing the story about the COVID situation. That's it. That makes sense. Like that's the answer. So the reason why it's perhaps my greatest fear is one, how do you trust the insights you come to? How do you have confidence in them, knowing this fact is true about how our minds function? How can you trust anything, right? And kind of the other side of that same coin, when do you stop questioning? When do you feel like, hey, I've hit a point, right? Or is it just an endless loop of, well, I don't know that that's true, so let me keep pushing, let me keep pushing, let me keep pushing. And where do you go with that, right? That could become very demoralizing or discouraging and feel like, well, what's the point? If I can't trust that anything is actually insightful or truthful, what's the point of doing this? And again, it could be somewhat counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. Now, I don't think that's the case. I do still think there is value in this. I do think it ties back to what I mentioned before, that you almost have to accept, I may never know for sure. But if I keep striving to be better and to think better, it will be a good thing. It will move me in the right direction. But it's where the idea of a few concepts I think come in, right? So as I think about that as my greatest fear, the question obviously becomes, well, what do you do about that? What do you do with it? I think there's a few concepts at play that help you in that scenario, not to prove it out, not to get to objective truth necessarily, but to help ensure that you are acting in good faith towards the objective you want, which is to think better and to be better. One is, I think you, as we've talked about, you don't seek certainty. You continue to doubt, you continue to question, no matter how concrete it feels, no matter how much that insight feels like, that's it, that's the answer, that's why I've been overweight my whole life, or that's why I can't find a good relationship and stick with somebody in the long term. Whatever it is that insight is, do not assume it is certain. Do not assume that is the conclusion. Assume it is another input and more information that should be tested, that should be proved out, and should continue to be questioned. As soon as you seek, or I shouldn't say seek, as soon as you think you've found that certainty, that's when you can fall into the trap. Now, it's true, it's possible that insight might be the thing, that might be the answer, right? But even if it is, why not test it? Why not continue to question it? There's really no risk in that. If anything, it will just keep proving out that seems true. So there's really a low risk and a high reward to continuously testing versus the flip. If you stop questioning and you say, well, that's it, I got the answer, higher risk, lower reward in that. So I think it logically makes sense to just keep questioning, keep checking. Another concept which I think is important here is the ideas we've talked about of checking your instruments. Oftentimes for ourselves, it's very hard to see, right, what the truth is, or at least a different perspective. The whole concept of checking your instruments comes from this idea of fighter pilots who, when they're flying, particularly in bad weather, at high altitudes and mountain ranges, clouds, etc., their eyes can only see so much. They need to rely on external instruments to tell them where they are, how close they are to the mountain, how close they are to other planes, their altitude, etc. So it's a similar principle. You need to have those instruments that you can check to help keep you honest. Saying it another way, don't just rely on yourself. Don't just make this an internal thing. There has to be other things you look to. That could be a family member, a spouse, a friend that you kind of sanity check yourself with. Part of those other instruments is also just flags in the way you think. Certainty, to me, is an instrument, as we just talked about in the last point. When you feel like you've reached certainty and I'm done, that should be a flag of like, oh, that's an instrument. Don't do that. Keep questioning, keep testing. So you want to find out whatever those instruments could be for you that would help you identify if that insight that you said wasn't the complete truth, or maybe wasn't true at all. How would you identify that? How would you determine it? Figure out what those things are and pursue those. So I think that's really important. And the last point related to all these, is I think you need to take the action, right? If you come to some hypothesis that says, I'll make it up, right? The reason I fight with my wife so much is that I hate my job, right? I've never been happy with my job. I feel emasculated in it. I feel like I'm not living up to my potential and I feel like a failure. And because I hate myself, I take it out on my wife. I'm just not happy, right? That feels deep and profound. And many people would say, hey, there's that feels like that could be it. And you could say, all right, I've solved this problem. Back to the point of it, right? Keep testing, keep questioning. Check your instruments in any way in which you can to see if that's true. But part of it is you have to do, right? If you believe that is true, logically, then you should fix that. Go change your job. Do something that makes you feel more fulfilled. Do something that makes you, love and be more proud of yourself, and see if it changes things, right? Go out and do the thing. And don't just do it at a superficial level. Commit to it. And by doing that, in many ways, that's the ultimate instrument that will tell you if there's truth in it or not, or if there's more to be had there. There's more to learn and more to understand. So I think obviously that can't be taken for granted. It's not just enough to come to the insight. You need to, in many ways, test it and do the thing, take the action, because in many ways that's where the truth lies. If you take that action and you're still fighting with your wife, maybe there's another inconvenient truth there that you don't want to admit. Maybe you don't really love your wife. Maybe you married the wrong person. Maybe there's something else in your life that's causing you problems, that's leading to this. Could be a whole host of reasons. But I think the net of this, the moral of this story is something that I really try and be cognizant of, and I struggle with to an extent, is how do I know? How do I know when insights I've found are true insights, or it's just my mind telling me, yeah, we need a story and that story is as good as anyone, and that one works for me. And hopefully these are some practical things that at least I use to try and address that and account for it.